Hello and welcome to my Kenne Bell twin screw supercharger installation video. In this video I'm going to be going over my installation of a 2.8 liter liquid cooled Kenne Bell supercharger on my 2012 5-liter Mustang. Before I started the supercharger installation, I wanted to get some baseline numbers on the car. So I headed over to Smokey's Dyno in North Canton, Ohio, and we strapped the car down to their Superflow dyno. The only modifications done to my car for the baseline runs were a cold air intake, an off-road X-pipe, and a tube. The car put down 434 rear wheel horsepower and 429 foot-pounds of torque. So when you order the kit from Kenne Bell, this is pretty much what you're going to get. A couple of big 80-pound boxes. Here's the first one opened up. You can see the heat exchanger and some heater hoses there. After you get that stuff out in a big chunk of foam, you can see the supercharger there. And then after I opened up the second box, there's the air filter, the air inlet. And then after I pulled that stuff out in another big chunk of foam, you can see the lower intake manifold upside down there. And then this bag has pretty much everything else in the kit. The water pump, the throttle body adapter plate, the injectors, all the hardware. Everything else is in this really big bag. Here's a better view of everything that comes in the kit. I have it all laid out on the table here. And at the end there you can see that that really big bag of stuff. Trust me, there's a lot of parts in there. Here's a before shot under the hood of my car. And now I'm pretty much going to start off with step 1 of the instructions. The Kenne Bell instructions are really good. There's a picture for just about every step. The steps are pretty easy to follow. There's no way I could cover them all in a short video like this, but what I'm going to try and do is focus on the ones that I didn't understand too well, or the ones that gave me trouble, and then the other important ones that I think people would want to see. Alright, this is step 1, which is pretty much wrapping the fenders of the car and wrapping the front bumper just to make sure that you don't scratch anything while you're doing the install. As is customary with almost any part you install on a car, go ahead and disconnect the negative battery terminal. If you've already installed an air intake before, then the first 20 or so steps are going to look pretty familiar. That's really all you're doing here is removing the engine cover, removing the factory air box, removing the mass airflow meter from the air intake. Be careful where it talks about the clip for the evap line. That clip is really easy to break. I broke mine. You can't buy the clip by itself from Ford. You have to buy the whole line. It's like $50 some. I ended up using a zip tie later to attach that line. I'll show you how I did that. Right, that brings us to the first real snag that I had in the installation. This is the result of what happened when I followed step 22 that says pull the power brake check valve out of the brake booster. I pulled and pulled on mine. I tried to be, somewhat gentle with it, and I couldn't get it to come out. And then I pulled a little bit harder, and this is what I got. I broke that fitting off where the actual line goes onto it. And I think really what happened here is that my booster was still under vacuum when I was pulling on it. I think if you pump the brake pedal a few times, you'll probably bleed that vacuum out of the booster, and this will probably come out a lot easier. This is where I was after step 38. You pretty much just take the fuel line off, unplug the throttle body, unbolt the intake manifold, and pull a few clips off the back and pretty much lift it right off. The next series of steps have you disassemble the factory intake manifold. The first thing that you're going to do is pull the injectors out while they're still attached to the fuel rail. And then after you get the fuel rail and the injectors out of the way, you can flip the intake manifold over and pull all the gaskets out of the bottom of it. These aren't really too bad to get out. I had to use a small screwdriver to get underneath of them because they're kind of hard to get your hands on, but once you get under them and you can actually grab a hold of them, they all come out pretty easily. I kept all of these in the same order that they were in the manifold to try and put them back on the same spot on the head. I doubt that matters, but that's the way I did it. Next, you're going to disassemble the fuel rail, and really you just have to pry all of these clips off the injectors. Once you kind of figure out how to get the screwdriver down in there, they come off pretty easily. You just kind of have to slide the screwdriver down past the clips that you can push on the side of the fuel rail, and they come off. One thing to be careful about, the last one of these that I took off, I shot it across the garage, so I guess just be careful when you're pulling these off there that you don't lose one. Next, you need to lubricate the new injectors with oil. I just use clean motor oil for this. I wipe a little bit around each of the O-rings and they snap down into the fuel rail. Next, you have to put the clips back on the injectors, and this part got a little bit confusing for me. Step 50 says note position of rail stubs. I have no idea what a rail stub is, but I think what they mean is that if you look at the body of the injector, there's a groove cut in it, and there's like a spot where the groove isn't cut, and that gives the clip a place to sit. So if you put the clip on where it kind of wants to go, the plug for the injector will be kind of off at an angle from the side of the fuel rail. And Kenne Bell doesn't want that. They want the plugs for the injectors to sit perpendicular straight out from the fuel rail. So once I kind of figured out what they wanted, you just kind of have to force the clip over that little piece of rubber that's on the side of the injector, and make sure that all the plugs sit perpendicular out from the fuel rail. After you get the front bumper off, step 63 says using a screwdriver, remove the air horn on the driver's side. What you're looking at here are tabs that hold the air horn pieces together. There's two halves to it. I had to separate the two halves to get it out of the car. I don't see how you could get it out in one piece. There's a couple more tabs down on the inside where the air actually flows through, and if you push on them, you can separate the two pieces. And there I am pulling the back part out of the engine bay, and then this is the front part where those other two tabs are, and I'm removing that from the front. After you get the inner fender and the headlight out, you're pretty much ready to cut the hole for the air intake. This is pretty much what it's going to look like when you get to that point. One thing that I would do that they don't tell you to do right now is to remove the horn. There's one bolt that holds it to the car, and it made it a lot easier for me to cut the hole for the air intake if I took that off. Okay, this is the part where you have to cut the hole for the air intake. And to be honest, this part wasn't as bad as it sounded. You know, when I first read the instructions and I read online that I had to cut a big hole in my car, I wasn't really excited about it. I think it's a little bit better than grinding the timing cover like you have to do with some other superchargers, because at least when you do this, you're getting cold air, you know, into the intake, so you're at least getting a benefit from it. Um, but it's really not that bad. You cut the templates out, you trim them, you tape them onto the car, and then you just follow the line. I actually cut this one probably a little bit higher than it needed to be, and later on when I'm mounting the bracket for the headlight, you can see that. Right there is where I was taking the horns off. Like I said, that cheap jigsaw that I bought, it was easier to maneuver in there after I took those off. And I just bought a couple of spare blades for that thing, and it pretty much cut right through it with no problem. Honestly, cutting the part on the inside was actually easier than this, which I thought the inside part was going to be harder. But you pretty much just cut around that half circle shape there, and it'll still kind of be connected in the back. But you pretty much just need to cut through that front piece with the template. This is pretty much what it looks like when you're done cutting in the front. Like I said, it's still attached in the back, but really all I did was just sort of push down on that front piece, and there was like that little part you can see back there with the hole in it. And I just used a pair of tin snips. I just kind of kept maneuvering that front piece and using the tin snips to cut through it. And then after you get that big part cut off of the front, it's a lot easier to get in there with the tin snips and sort of trim off what's left. It looks a little brutal right now, but it actually turned out really clean and really neat. Here's what it looked like after I got that all trimmed out. And like the instructions said, I just took a file to the edge of it so that the rubber molding that they give you to go around there would slip on easily. This is where I finally had my template taped on the inside, and I probably had this on and off the car about 10 times. And at first I kept trying to use the picture that they give you in the instructions to locate it, but then I realized that the way that I trimmed it out of the paper wasn't identical to the way that they trimmed it out of the paper, so it's really hard to use that picture to figure out where it goes. But what I did finally figure out is that left to right, you can use the half circle shape that you already cut in the front. And then if you just take that part where the arrow is pointing that says front and push that all the way up to the vertical part that that's still there, that's pretty much where it needs to be. Um, right here you can see the piece that I cut out, and like I said, I used that jigsaw on the inside. It went through it. It cut through the metal easily. It's just maneuvering it down in there. That's why I think that if you have a smaller, pneumatic saw that you can fit down in there better, it'd be a lot easier. Here you can see the hole with a little bit of the template still left on it. I did have to go back in once and trim out a little bit more after test fitting the pipe. Here it is with the pipe installed. I have the bolt going through the bracket that actually holds the air intake where it belongs, and there you can see where it comes down through the front. Since there's no throttle body on the car, there's nowhere to mount the top of the pipe, so it kind of makes the intake lean over. But there you can see I kind of pushed on the top of it to kind of put it where it goes, and it pretty much comes straight through the hole that you cut. You can kind of see there that the top of mine is up a little bit too high. It doesn't quite need to be up that high, but I kind of really only wanted to cut it once. Then here you can see down through there, it's touching in a couple of places, but there when I push on it, you can see the light start to come through. So it's really just touching the rubber molding that you put on there, and the molding stays on pretty good in most places, but there are a couple other ones where I had to put a little dab of silicone on it and then put a clamp on it so that it would stay. After I did that and the silicone dried, it was fine. It didn't move at all. Next, you have to reposition the knock sensors. The first few steps of this are just cutting all of this tape and wire loom off of the knock sensors. It's a little bit hard to get through the knife, and just kind of took my time and tried not to cut through any of the wires or my fingers. And once you get all of the tape trimmed back off of the middle part there, and you get enough of it off of the part where the wires actually go to the sensors, you can expose these little plastic 90-degree clips that hold the wires off of the actual knock sensor plug, and you have to take those off so that you can sort of lay the wires where you want them. There you can see I took one off that side. Really, this is just a matter of taking your time and fighting through all this tape. Okay, once you get all the tape and everything off and the clips off, you can go ahead and loosen up the knock sensors. It's just a 10mm bolt in each one, and loosen both of them up so that the clips will move freely. To put the knock sensors where they go, you take a feeler gauge set at 70 thousandths, and you put it in between the clip for the knock sensor, the plug for it, and the side of the head. This would be easier to do with an extra set of hands, but I mean you can get by. I just sort of held the feeler gauge against the head with the knock sensor, and then tighten the bolt down. And here's what you should have when you're done. That feeler gauge should just sort of drag when it goes in between the clip and the head. This is on the driver's side, and I pretty much repeated the same thing as the passenger side. I put the feeler gauge in between the clip and the head, and I tightened the bolt down. The clip on this knock sensor kind of moves around a little bit. So here when I go to put the feeler gauge back in, it kind of won't go in. And then I sort of wiggle the clip and now it's loose. And then I push the clip over and now it's tight. So I kind of just tried to center the clip in the middle where it would go, where it would sit naturally, and make sure that the feeler gauge was kind of snug in there. So after you get the wires taped back together, you put the loom back on them. You're supposed to tape them down to the top of the block with this aluminum tape that they provide. Now when I installed this kit, it was about 30 degrees outside, and my engine block was probably about the same. I couldn't get the tape to stick. I cleaned the top of the motor like they said with carb cleaner, and I let it dry, and I really pushed on the tape and tried to work it down on there, but I couldn't get it to stick at all. It stuck to the wires just fine, but it absolutely would not stick to the motor. The only way that I could see to get the tape to stick is to warm up the top of the engine. So I just set my shop light on top of it, and if you've ever used one of these, you know how hot they get. And this actually worked really well. I left it on there for about 15 minutes, and it heated everything up, heated the wires up, made them really soft, and allowed the tape to stick pretty good. I used the picture in the instructions as a template on where to tape down the wires, where to make them lay and everything. Like I said, the heat from the light really softened the wires up so they were easy to put right where I wanted them, and it made the tape stick a lot better. After I pretty much got everything all taped down and in place, I put the light back on top just to sort of warm up the tape and make sure that the glue on it was soft enough to stick to everything. Next, you prep the lower intake manifold to put it on the car. Really, that's just a matter of taking the factory gaskets from the stock intake manifold and putting them into the grooves cut in this one. They push right down in there with no trouble. And then you want to take the bypass tube that goes on the front and run a bead of silicone around where the gasket goes. What I put there may have been just a tad too much. I just let it squish out though. Then go ahead and put the gasket on there and take the 4 bolts that mount that to the front of the intake and cover them in Teflon paste so that it doesn't suck any air. And then after you get those 4 covered, you can just go ahead and bolt the bypass tube onto the front of the lower intake manifold. Next was to lower the intake manifold actually down onto the engine. They're not kidding when they say to get help for this. It's not really a matter of the weight. It's fishing it down past all the stuff that's on top of the engine. There's the heater hoses that are on each side, and then all of the clips for the injectors really get in the way. There you can see my other friend came over to actually help pull that stuff out of the way, and it was still kind of stuck on the heater hose there. Once you do get all that stuff, see how we did pick it back up. Once you get all that stuff out of the way, it'll drop right down on there. But it's just a matter of it probably would have been better in the beginning to actually maybe try and zip tie that stuff out of the way or move it out of the way, especially if you're trying to do this by yourself. Try and get all that stuff completely out of the way so that you can get it to go down on there. And those 2 heater hoses in the back were the last thing that actually had it hung up. The ones right by the firewall. Even after I got the intake manifold down on the heads, it wasn't sitting flush. You can see here, but when I actually push on it, that it's sort of rocking back and forth. I still don't know what it was sitting on. I don't know if it was one of the gaskets that kind of needed pushed down in or what, but I mean, there you can see me pushing on it, and it's definitely wiggling around. And my intention was to grab the bypass tube on the front of it and sort of pick up and then set it down on there again. I thought maybe it wasn't lined up perfectly right or what. And I grabbed the bypass tube, the front of the intake manifold, and I set it back down on there. And then I pushed down on the tube a little bit, and it sort of snapped down. And there now you can see me pushing on it, and it's not moving at all. So just be sure that you have that thing in place before you put the bolts in it or anything, because you want to make sure it's flush before you tighten the bolts down. When you go to bolt the lower intake manifold down, there's 6 shorter bolts and there's 4 longer bolts. At this point, leave the 4 longer bolts out. Those are going to hold the fuel rail down, and you don't have the fuel rail in yet, so you can just go ahead and leave those out. If you look at step 135, it tells you to leave out 2 of the bolts. But you had to put in 2 alignment pins before you put these bolts in to line up the intake manifold anyway, so they're assuming that you don't put those in or the other 2. Um, you'll notice on my intake manifold there's 4 raised bosses that are cast into the intake manifold. That's where the tabs for the fuel rail sit. All of the production manifolds are made that way, so you don't have to worry about putting washers underneath there. After you clamp a couple of heater hoses onto the back of the intake manifold, it's time to lubricate the bottom O-ring on the injectors. Again, I just used clean motor oil for this and wiped a little bit around each O-ring. And you can go ahead and set the fuel rail with the injectors down onto the intake manifold. This is another thing that it helps to have a friend with. Like I said, the injector clips and that other heater hose get in the way, so if you have somebody on the other side to help pull that hose over, it makes the fuel rail drop down in there a lot easier. This next part is where you have to pull the heater hose over top of the fuel rail. The first time that I tried to pull it up over there, I just kind of popped the fuel rail and the injectors back out of the intake manifold. So I would say that if you're alone, probably put a bolt in that passenger side rear bolt hole to hold that down. In this case, I just had my friend hold it down while I pulled on the heater hose, and you kind of get the front of it started and then just sort of keep rolling it, and you'll roll the rest of it right up over top of the fuel rail. It's really not that hard to do. So now you can go ahead and drop in 3 of the 4 bolts that hold the fuel rail down. They tell you to put all 4 of them in, and then they tell you to take the passenger side front one back out. So you can just go ahead and leave that one out. You'll put that one in when you do the bypass tube a little bit later on. As far as the other 3, just use the bolts and a washer on top of the fuel rail. Those, like I said before, those bosses are already cast into the intake on the production model, so you don't have to worry about using washers underneath it or anything like that. Just use the bolts and put a washer on top of the fuel rail tabs and go ahead and bolt them down. Okay, this is the part where you need to mount the front plate, they call it, and it's the big bracket that goes on the front of the engine where the idlers for the belt go on. There's 2 smooth idlers and there's 1 grooved one. This part is a little bit annoying because to put this plate on, you have to take the water pump pulley off. But to hold the pulley still to get the bolts off, you have to leave the belt on, loosen the bolts, take the belt off, take the pulley off, mount the plate, and then put the belt back on so you can tighten the water pump pulley bolts, and then take the belt back off again. Here you can see this clip that was hitting the plate when I put it on. I had trouble getting the bolts lined up at first, and I couldn't figure out why. It's because the end of the plate was hitting this clip. It slides over a stud on the front of the head. So you can see I pried that clip off, and that allowed the plate to go into place. They didn't say this in the instructions, but I mean it's pretty straightforward. You can't put the plate on without moving that. Here you can see me mounting one of the idlers onto the plate. These are pretty basic. There's the idler, there's a sleeve that goes in the middle of it, and a bolt. You've got 2 of the smooth ones like that, and then the grooved one that you can kind of see down in the bottom corner there. The top smooth one will change depending on the size of the pulley that you're running. So if you're running the stock pulley, it's all the way up in the top position, and then if you go to a smaller one, you have to move it down. After you plug a couple of extension harnesses in and zip tie them around the back of the motor and run them over to the other side where the throttle body is going to be, you get to the first part of the job where you have to solder something. And basically there's 2 connections that you have to make here. There's a violet and gray wire that you have to cut off of the existing plug, and then there's a blue wire that you have to tap into. So The violet and gray one you can just go ahead and cut off, and then you'll solder the new one that goes to the IAT sensor for the lower intake manifold. And then this blue wire that you can see here, that's all you want to do is just strip back a little piece of that blue wire so that you can tee into it. And then you'll just wrap the other wire around that and then make your solder connection. There's even a supplement that they put in the instructions for this because I think they're concerned with people cutting through that blue wire because you don't need to. Okay, here's a view of us doing exactly what you're not supposed to do, which is heat shrink tubing with a lighter. The reason that I kind of bring this up is because at the time I was doing this, I didn't have a heat gun, and I can promise you by the end of the job you're going to need one, so you might as well just go buy one at the beginning, and that way you can shrink all your heat shrink tubing properly. Okay, that brings us to step 202, which is where you need to mount the speed nut to the shock tower so that you can attach the evap solenoid. And this is the first time where I felt like the instructions were inadequate. The picture that they show you is more, I think, for a 2011 car, and I believe that there's some kind of bracket there, and you can just slip a speed nut over that bracket. But on my 2012, there's nothing there. There's just the shock tower, and there's a couple holes in it. So here you can see how I mounted the bracket that they give you to the shock tower. I put a nut on the back of that bolt on the inside of the shock tower out by the wheel, and I mounted that on, and that gave me a place to mount the aluminum block that they give you that relocates the evap solenoid. I'm still not 100% sure if this is how this goes, but it looks good and it worked. And the best I can tell from the instructions, this is how it's supposed to go. So I just took the sound deadening material and I trimmed it out a little bit further. That square hole that's already cut in it, I trimmed it out a little bit further, and then pushed it back on and put the plastic clip back in it, and that really made it look clean, and it gave me a spot to mount the evap solenoid. After you cut a couple of your stock hoses apart to use the fittings from them, you can slide them into the hose and then attach it to the evap solenoid. Like I said earlier, I broke that clip for the evap solenoid. So after I put the fitting onto the solenoid, I just slid a zip tie into where the clip would go, and I tightened it down, and it worked just like the clip. It kept the hose from coming off. Seeing as how I can't buy that clip separate, this is as good as it's going to get. And then you pretty much just have to attach the evap hose to the other end by the firewall. Before you mount the intercooler, you have to run a couple of more lines. There's a PCV line and the fuel line. They're both pretty straightforward except for how the PCV line zip ties to this bracket. The instructions just say to zip tie it to the bracket, but there's no hole in it and there's no tab on it. There's no way for that zip tie to catch. I couldn't get it to stay, so I put 2 zip ties on it. I tried to show it here in this picture. I wrapped one around the bracket and then another one that goes through that first one around the hose. Okay, after you get your intercooler brackets assembled, this is pretty much what it's going to look like, and the instructions are really good here. I mean, you follow the pictures, you put it together like they say, and it's going to fit fine. I did measure over and over and over, and I got those dimensions in between the holes and where the brackets are located exactly right. And because I did that, it went right on without any trouble at all. Okay, this is me mounting the intercooler to the front of the car. And really the reason that you're mounting it right now, it's going to come back off. The reason that you're mounting it right now is so that you can mark the holes that you're going to cut through the plastic flap that's on the passenger side of the radiator so that you can get the hoses run through there. Like I said before, I got those brackets in the exact spot that they said, and I pretty much set those bolts through the top of the core support and then push the intercooler, assembly with the brackets up, and I hardly even pushed those bolts out of the top. I was able to push it pretty much right up on there, and then just, you can see there by myself, get the nuts to go in the bottom and put the nuts on there and tighten it down. Here's a couple of pictures showing the intercooler after it's mounted in place. Alright, next you're going to trim the holes through that plastic flap for the intercooler lines to come through. This is pretty straightforward. You have the intercooler mounted. You take a paint marker and you mark the holes. I use the hole saw and my jigsaw to cut them out, and a razor blade a little bit for the rubber part. One thing to watch out for on this, it says on step 252, it says to remove the flap, And then on step 253 it says to mark the holes, but you want to mark the holes before you remove the flap, so just look ahead for that. Alright, and here's a view of the intercooler finally mounted on the car with the elbows on and the hoses all ran to it and everything. Here you can see the bolt that's in the front. These are the two that you have to drill the holes for. That one, the washer is a little bit tight up against the vertical piece, but it kind of bent over when I tightened it down, so it turned out okay. And then this is the other side where you can see the holes that I trimmed in the flap, and then the other bolt in the front there that I had to drill the hole for. The last couple things that you have to do before you can get to modifying the headlight are mount the intercooler pump, mount the relay for the intercooler pump, and then wire it. What you're looking at there is where I mounted the relay for the intercooler pump, and it was at a pretty good spot. That hole was already in the car, and it was down out of the way. You can't see this at all once you put the cover back on. And here's all the wires that are in the bottom of that fuse box. You have to tap into one of these, similar to the way that you tapped into the blue wire for the MAF. It's one of the wires in the front. You pretty much just strip back a little bit of the covering on the wire and then solder the power supply to the water pump so it turns on with the key. And then after you get the water pump all mounted and the lines ran in and wired in and everything, you can mount the coolant reservoir. You can see that there. It just has a bracket on the front of it that pinches the top fin of the radiator. It's a little bit difficult to get a ratchet and a hex bit underneath that thing to tighten the bolts, but I managed to do it. The next thing that you have to do is mount the headlight back in the car, and this requires some modification to the headlight assembly. Before you put that aluminum bracket on that you're going to mount the third bolt to, there's another bolt that goes over on the left there, and that's just holding the car back together since you cut it apart when you cut that hole for the air intake. And then that aluminum bracket needs to be lined up right with the bottom of the opening for the headlight, and that's going to give you somewhere to put the third headlight bolt because the third one went where the hole is now for the air intake. Okay, here's my car with the headlight mounted back in, and with this slowed down video I'm going to try and show you exactly how that goes on the car. It's a little bit shaky because I was trying to do this by hand and it's hard to get the camera up underneath the car like this, but there's a black plastic tab on the bottom of the headlight assembly, and it has like some ribs on the back of it. You need to put that on the car and then scribe a line across it where the bottom of that aluminum bracket is. And you can see there where I've already cut mine off, and you can see those ribs behind it. And then you need to drill a hole right through the center of that, and you're actually going to drill a hole right through that center rib to put that third bolt in that's going to hold it to that aluminum bracket. And it's a little bit hard to keep the drill bit straight, but I mean it's at least plastic that you're dealing with. I didn't get mine perfectly straight through. It was at a little bit of an angle, and I had to kind of open up the hole a little bit bigger than the bolt to get it to go through. But that's pretty much what you need to do. You need to cut the bottom of that tab off, drill a hole through it, and then run the bolt through and make sure that that black plastic thing sits flush against the aluminum bracket, and that way your headlight will still be pointing in the same direction that it was before. One more thing is that on step 349 they tell you to cut the headlight adjuster off, and they don't tell you that until the headlight's back in the car. I did that before I put the headlight back in. It made it a lot easier. And what you're looking at here are the spark plugs that I used. Step 354, Kenne Bell says to regap the stock spark plugs. I ended up going with the Ford Racing 1 heat range coulter plugs. And you can see here I just covered the threads in anti-seize and then covered the porcelain in the other end in dielectric grease so that the boot wouldn't stick. The next step is to trim out the coil cover for the new PCV fitting. You can see here how mine's trimmed out. I used a pair of tin snips to do this, and I would definitely recommend not doing that. Mine didn't really like cut out, it more like broke out, and I think I was just lucky that I didn't ruin the coil cover. I would use like a Dremel or a hacksaw blade or something for this. If you get to the point where you're looking at this, you should be pretty excited because that means it's about time to mount the supercharger. And I really just took these couple pictures to show the screws because once it's on the car, you can't see them, and I thought they were pretty cool looking. Now it's time to mount the supercharger to the lower intake manifold. The first thing that I want to talk about here is the bypass valve. There you can see the bypass valve is mounted to the rear inlet, but when I took the supercharger out of the box, it wasn't. And I noticed this before I tried to put it on the car, so I skipped ahead to step 407, and they basically say that typically they mount that at the factory, but sometimes to prevent damage during shipping they don't. So I just went ahead and mounted that. That way it was easier. I didn't have to do it once the supercharger was on the car. The second thing is that after I got the supercharger down on the car, it felt solid. It felt like it was on there flat. It didn't rock. It didn't move around, but it didn't look like it was down in that recessed groove on the lower manifold. So I kind of fiddled around with it for a while because I thought that it wasn't in the right place, and I just kept picking it up and putting it back down and moving it around. And it just didn't look like it was down into that groove that's machined into the lower intake manifold. But I put a few of the bolts in, and I just easily started tightening them down, and they really didn't give me a lot of resistance, and it pulled the supercharger right down into there. So I guess as long as you just make sure that it's flat and it's not rocking, you should be okay. This is what it's going to look like after you get the supercharger mounted down onto the lower intake manifold. The last thing that I wanted to talk about here is the PCV hose that they tell you to mount in step 371. They tell you to trim a little bit of it off to prevent kinking, but even when I trimmed some off, I couldn't get it to go on there without bending it. So I rotated that fitting that's in the rear inlet of the supercharger. I rotated it back toward the firewall a little bit, and that made the hose come onto it at a much better angle, and then it didn't kink or anything. After you get that coolant line rerouted to the top of the recovery bottle, you can mount the throttle body. And what you're seeing here is the adapter plate that allows you to mount the throttle body to the Mammoth air inlet, and it pretty much uses the gasket that came, that was between the stock throttle body and the factory intake, and an O-ring on the back. So what you're going to watch now is me try and mount the stock throttle body to that adapter plate. If you're paying close attention, you probably already noticed that there's something that's wrong about that plate. But I mean, I did what anybody would do. I put the throttle body on there. I tried to get the bolts started, and so I could go ahead and tighten them down. And I fumbled with this for a little bit, trying to get the bolts started, and I couldn't get them started. I tried one in the other hole. I couldn't get it started there. And then finally I took the throttle body back off just to try and put one of the bolts into the plate to see if it would start. And that's when I noticed that the plate was not tapped for those bolts. You can see there that there's no threads cut into that plate. So it was unfortunate that this plate missed a few of the machining steps, but this happened in the evening, like 6 or 7 o'clock, and I was able to call Kenne Bell and tell them about it because they're out on the West Coast, and they shipped me out a plate that day. They overnighted it to me, and I had it by like noon the next day. So it was unfortunate that it happened, but they definitely fixed the mistake. What you're looking at here is the pigtail that plugs into the throttle body, and the way I have it ran right now is underneath the inlet out by the injector harness by the heater hose there. That's the side of the inlet that you want to put it on before you set the supercharger down. I didn't do that. I had it, this comes around from that extension harness from the other side of the motor, and I had it behind the inlet, and I had to fish it underneath there, and it's not easy to do. And this picture pretty much just shows how I ran the vacuum line off of the bypass valve. I kind of wrapped it down around the front and then tucked it behind the fuel rail so that it would kind of contour the valve and stay neat. Since I couldn't put the throttle body on, I couldn't put the air intake on or any of the pieces that went with it, so I skipped ahead to step 405 and I installed the new belt. Here's a better view of the bypass tube assembled. There's 2 couplers, 4 hose clamps, and you just assemble this in between the tube that comes off the lower manifold and the bypass valve, and then you can go ahead and put that last bolt in that goes through the top. This is a close-up of the bypass valve, and basically there's those hose clamps right there. and they want you to make sure that they don't interfere with the operation of the bypass valve. So you can see that little gap right there in between the edge of the hose clamp and the arm of the bypass valve, and they just want you to move that back and forth to make sure that it doesn't hit that hose clamp. The next series of steps are specific to the liquid-cooled version of the kit, which is the one that I got. This fitting came with a kit, and the instructions said that it should be assembled, but it wasn't, so I just put some Teflon paste on that fitting and then tightened it into the other fitting. These are some pictures that I tried to take to show where that fitting goes. You have to remove the factory coolant reservoir, and then there's the feed line that comes off of the water pump that goes to the bottom of the Kenne Bell reservoir. You have to cut a section out of it. You can see there where I cut a piece out and put that fitting in. And then the third line that comes off of the fitting goes to the front of the supercharger. Then you just fill up the reservoir and the heat exchanger and everything with a mixture of distilled water and coolant. And you have to be getting near the end when you can go ahead and reinstall the negative battery terminal. And then you can just go ahead and turn the key on, and that's going to let the pump run. You can actually hear the pump running in this video. There you can see the reservoir is full of coolant, and that's pretty much all you're doing, is just letting the pump run for a while to get all the bubbles out of the system, and then you can look everywhere and check for leaks. I was really fortunate with mine. I mean, there really are a lot of water hose connections in this system, and none of mine leaked at all. The next day I got the new throttle body adapter plate from Kenne Bell. This is what it looks like. You can see that it's all machined, and it has threads cut for the throttle body bolts right there. Before you mount the throttle body, you need to put the O-ring and the gasket in it. Now this O-ring, it's a little deceiving here because this went in really easily because I had already put it in the other plate, the wrong one. It's actually kind of hard to get down in there to get it to fit right. You kind of have to work it around a lot, but it'll go in. It's the right length. Then you just go ahead and put the factory throttle body gasket in the front of it, and then you're ready to mount it to the air inlet. Okay, then you're ready to mount the adapter plate to the Mammoth air inlet, and then after you do that, you can mount the throttle body. And if you notice here, I put a couple of the bolts in the throttle body before I remembered that the holes in the adapter plate where the throttle body bolts go in are through holes, and you need to put Teflon paste on those throttle body bolts. So here you can see a bolt that I've put some Teflon paste on, and this is pretty simple, just to keep air from getting sucked in past the threads. So go ahead and cover the threads on 4 of those bolts, and then you're ready to actually tighten down the throttle body. After you get the throttle body in place, you can go ahead and mount the air intake. Really, this is just putting a fitting in the air intake for the PCV line, bolting the MAF into it, and then wiggling it down into the car. It takes a little bit of wiggling to get it into place just right, to get it down through the hole that you cut, and to get it into that coupler on the throttle body. You'll also probably notice that when I was test fitting it, it was chrome, and now it's black. Kenne Bell didn't have any black ones in stock when I bought my kit. They only had chrome ones, so that's what they shipped me, and I just had this one powder coated black. This is just a picture of the air filter mounted onto the air intake. That brings us to step 441, where they tell you to reinstall the inner fender. And here you can see a hole where the push pin is supposed to go through, but you can't even see the hole behind it. It's hitting the air intake tube on the other side. So there you can see that that push pin is installed, and it's where it's supposed to be. And up there on the top, you can see that one of the push pins is in and the other hole is lined up. But when you look at the front here, it's not even close. That needs to be up against that flat part of the car right there so you can bolt it on. And there's a huge gap there. Here's the back of it where it's actually hitting the air intake tube. The only way that I could see to get this to go back on was to use a heat gun. That's why I said earlier in the video that you're definitely going to need a heat gun. There you can see it kind of bulging around there. That's me pushing on it to kind of force it into place. So after I put a heat gun to it for a little while and just pushed on it, really, this is what it looks like. It doesn't really look like it's bulged through that bad. You can just sort of see a crease there where that little dimple is. But if you look here, the gap is completely gone. It's all the way up against the front of the car. It fits, I mean, pretty much exactly like it's supposed to be. So I'm even pulling on the inner fender there, and it goes right back up against it. There you can see that push pin is installed, and that hole lined up, and it was flush up against there. That's the part where it's kind of bulged out from the air intake. And then there's one of the upper push pins, and then there's the other two. And then here's the back of it where you can see that the inner fender is sort of molded around the air intake a little bit more. Alright, the next step has you put the front bumper back on. And I would just be careful when you're doing this. There's like a really thin specific place on the edge where you have to fit the bumper into. And if you don't get it in the right spot, you can just sort of bend what's behind there and it won't sit flush. So just pay really close attention when you go to put the edge of the bumper on where it meets up to the fender, that you get it in the right spot. Step 453 has you reinstall the splash pan. What I'm trying to show here is that when I put my splash pan back on, it pinched the hose that comes off of that water pump against the bottom of the radiator. Well, you can kind of see it there. It's not really pinched off, but it's definitely squished some, and I was afraid that when it got hot it would collapse even more. So I took the splash pan back off. I marked it with a paint marker. When the hose was there, I took it back off and I cut a notch in it, and that way it just allowed the hose to go through there without getting squished. You can see a little bit better here. I just used the jigsaw that I used earlier and notched it out. Okay, after I got my splash pan back on, this is pretty much what my car looked like. Once you get to this point, you're ready to load the tune on, and then you're pretty much done. Just time to fire it up. I did notice after driving the car around a little bit that the pulley was cutting into the hood liner, so I'm going to have to probably trim that out a little bit so that it clears. Okay, after I got the installation done, I headed back over to Smokey's Dyno to get the after numbers on their Superflow dyno. Okay, here's the dyno graph after the Supercharger install. The car made 600 horsepower and 498 foot-pounds. And then here are the two dyno graphs laid over top of each other, the stock one and the after the Supercharger one.